What's good, my fellow GeoGeeks and MetaMappers? Spatial Ninja here, bringing you this next episode of MetaMapping. And today we're going to be talking about ArcGIS services. Now, what are ArcGIS services? Well, they're web services, either in ArcGIS Enterprise or ArcGIS Online, that provide you access to mapping capabilities, map data, or other spatial capabilities over a web service. Now, there's lots of different types of ArcGIS services that exist, so I thought it would be a good idea to go through and define what those services are and how you may leverage them in your day-to-day web mapping. So let's jump right into it and start with a map service. Now, there are two different types of map services. There's dynamic map services as well as cached map services. And when you view these service types within ArcGIS portal, either in Enterprise or online, if you're leveraging a map service that's dynamic, it'll be called a map image layer. If you're leveraging a cached map service, it'll be a tile layer. So what is a dynamic map service? Well, a map service serves out map images, PNG formats or JPEGs. And these map image layers are actually drawn on the server side at the time that they are requested from a client or the end user. So as soon as you make that web service request, the server is creating and drawing those map images and returning them to the web application. Now, there's a few benefits of using a dynamic map service. You can have more advanced map labeling provided by the Maplex label engine within ArcGIS, and you have improved security as server-side drawing only returns images and not the actual GIS data itself. So what's the difference between this map service, which is dynamic, and a cached map service? Well, a cached map service serves out pre-cached images that are cached on the server. They are the fastest way to serve out maps over the web. So instead of each time the server creating these map images with each request, you've pre-cached at different scales all of these images that live on the server. And this is how ArcGIS Online or Google Maps, Bing Maps, and many other services expose their maps through these cached map services. Now, map services are probably the most commonly used service within ArcGIS, but there's a new kid on the block called a feature service. Now, unlike map services, which serve out map images, a feature service serves out layers and features as structured text like XML and JSON. And a feature layer is drawn on the client side based on symbology set within the service. So you're actually getting the data returned from the server to the client app with a feature service. Now, it's similar to a map service in that when you're viewing this data over a client application, you can see where this data exists on the map and you have symbology, but that symbology is maintained within the service versus these images being pre-created on the server side. That's why we can see here that a feature service is essentially a map service with feature access enabled when you go in and you look at the ArcGIS server settings. And when you access a feature service within the ArcGIS portal environment, it'll be called a feature layer. Now, one of the benefits of using a feature service over a map service is that you can actually customize a feature symbology on the client side, unlike map services. Again, since a map service is creating those images on the server and just returning them to the client app, there's no way to actually modify the look and feel of that GIS data. But feature services, since the symbology is stored within the service, it's exposed to client applications, allowing you to go in and change how you want your features to be symbolized within web maps. Another benefit of using feature services is that you have editing and querying capabilities of the geometry of that data. So if you want to do any type of spatial analysis or querying of a selecting of multiple features or editing of those GIS features, that's where a feature service is used. And a feature service can expose your points, lines, and polygon as geometry data, or you can publish a feature service just from a non-spatial table. And those layers within your portal environment are called table layers. So that's feature services. Next is vector tile services. Now these services are published from a vector tile package, and they are similar to image tiles from map services, but they actually store a vector representation of the data. This allows for client-side drawing of the vector tiles, which allows for these tiles to be customized for the purpose of the map, which drives dynamic, interactive cartography within your web maps and your client applications. So you can think of vector tile services as a way to cache your vector-based maps, but expose some of the vector representation of your features client side so that you can do things like change symbology or store some level of attribution within those vector tiles. This type of service is great if you want a very performant web service without caching all of those map images on the server. So next we have image services. Now there's a few different types of image services: dynamic, cached, and cached type LERC. So let's first start with image services that are dynamic. Now, image services are a way to process and share collections of imagery and raster files. So unlike the feature service, which is providing access to your points, lines, and polygons, your vector data, image services serve out your GIS data that is in an imagery or raster format. And image services can be created from either a single image, or they can be created and have multiple bands and dimensions and be either small in size or very large in size. Now, image services can be comprised of a collection of orthomosaics covering a state or county. So multiple image files mosaiced together in which you can attribute with different metadata or acquisition dates of those raster images. So you may have aerial imagery captured at multiple times throughout the year, and an image service can take all of those image files and mosaic them together. And through an image service, a client application can dynamically mosaic all those images, or you can query and call for just one image and we return one image to your web map or your client application. Now, the great thing about a dynamic image service is you're accessing those raw images directly from the client application. So if you want to do any type of on-the-fly reprocessing or any type of raster analytics, you can do that using a dynamic image service. Now, inside of your ArcGIS portal environment, these are called imagery layers. Now, you can also have image services that are cached, which are tiled imagery layers. Again, very similar to a cached map service, except that a image service that is cached is leveraging those raster and imagery files. You can think of a cached image service as a service very similar to a base map of aerial photography, where you've got that aerial photography for the entire world that has been pre-cached on the server so that rendering and drawing that imagery is very performant in your web or your client applications. Now, you can also use image services to include a large collection of digital terrain models and elevation services. Now, if you create an image service using that type of data, this is then an elevation layer within your ArcGIS portal environment. Now, one important aspect to all of these ArcGIS service types is that there's this notion of reference registered data versus hosted data. So what does that actually mean? Well, if you have your GIS data being maintained in an enterprise geodatabase, an SDE, or PostGIS, or some sort of other relational database that your organization is managing, you want to be able to publish that map service or that feature service off of that existing database. You'll do this by publishing these services as reference registered data, which means that that database or that database server needs to be registered with your ArcGIS server environment. Now, this capability is only made available through ArcGIS Enterprise. Now, the second option when publishing these different service types is using hosted data. This is actually where you use the ArcGIS hosted data store, and when you publish these services, you're packaging up the data and you're copying it to the server, and you're using ArcGIS to manage the data in the data store. Now, ArcGIS offers different types of data stores depending on the service that you're publishing. There's relational data stores, tile cache, big data, graph, and object data stores. So if you're publishing an image service and you're caching it, you may be using a tile cache data store, versus if you're publishing a feature service and you're creating a hosted feature layer, you'll be using the relational data store. So depending on the use case or need, you may have existing databases that you want to publish a service off of, or you may want to take your data, package it up, and copy it directly to the ArcGIS server and use the ArcGIS managed data store. So now let's quickly go through some additional service types and some kind of non-traditional ArcGIS services. First, starting with our scene service. This is also a newer player on the block here. And scene services, which are also known as scene layers within your ArcGIS portal, allow you to share 3D content. You can visualize 3D objects such as exterior shells of buildings or objects that are modeled in 3 dimensions. You can visualize 3D building models derived from building information models or BIM, or from Revit or IFC data. These scene services also support texturized continuous integrated meshes, or that reality capture data that is coming from sensor-based processing, either using aerial imagery or drones. Scene services also support point clouds with LiDAR data, which provide fast display of large volumes of symbolized and filtered point cloud data, as well as voxels, which represent this multi-dimensional volumetric 3D and 4D data. So any type of 3D data that you may be creating or generating today, you can publish that data to a web service using this ArcGIS scene service. Next is our geocode service. And geocoding is the process of turning textual representation of a place or address into a map representation of its location, right? So each time you type in an address, you want to know the lat long of where that address is, or reverse geocoding, which is the opposite of that. I have a lat long and I want to know what is at that location. So these different types of geocode services, which are represented as locators within the ArcGIS portal environment, allow users to find different addresses or points of interest, parcels, and other assets. The next 2 services are different types of spatial analysis services. First, starting with a geoprocessing service. This provides users access with different types of analysis tools as a service. So think of creating a buffer or performing a intersect, and you want to be able to run that spatial process through a web application or over a web service. Now, a geoprocessing service will leverage geoprocessing tasks that perform the analysis and run on the server. And then when that task is complete, the result of that task is then exposed through an API, which means you can have a web map or a web application or another system leverage a geoprocessing service, run spatial analysis server side, get the result back, and plug it into another system or visualize the results of that task on your web map. The other type of analysis service is a network analysis service. And this type of analysis is specific to routing, like finding the best path or getting driving directions. And network analysis services leverage network data sets to be able to calculate that optimal route based on the network topology. Again, the perfect example of a network analysis service is in vehicle routing. So trying to find the optimal route from point A to point B. Now, both the geoprocessing service and network analysis services will be shown in your ArcGIS portal environment as tools. So winding down the last two services that I wanted to cover on this episode. The first is your stream service. And a stream service emphasizes low latency and real-time data dissemination for client-side data flows. Now, these services leverage a WebSocket to push data to a client app versus a client app sending a web request for data to the server each time it needs to draw a map like in a feature service. So the result of this is more of a continual feed of data being pushed to those web maps and applications, which is optimal for that real-time data. That data like vehicles moving along the map. And finally is the OGC service. So the Open Geospatial Consortium, or OGC, web services make data available in an open and internationally recognized format over the web. Now, these OGC services have very similar characteristics as other ArcGIS services like Web Map Services or WMS, or Web Feature Services like WFS. But again, they are standard service types that are provided by the OGC. Now, ArcGIS Server and ArcGIS Enterprise, as well as in ArcGIS Online, support OGC services. So if you have other applications that also require not an ArcGIS service, but an OGC, you can still publish your data into ArcGIS and have OGC compliant services to integrate with your existing applications. So this has been an overview of the different ArcGIS service types. I hope you guys enjoyed this content and maybe learned something new. It would really help out the channel if you like and subscribe to MetaMapping. And be sure to go follow us on all the different socials. And thanks again for watching. And as always, stay mappy, my friends.